The heavy, metallic scent of iron blood and crushed lavender hung thick in the air of the high court, a suffocating reminder that magic always demands a price, and today the price was her soul. Elara Thorne stood at the precipice of a destiny she no longer wanted, her hands trembling beneath sleeves of enchanted silk. For a decade she had breathed for him. She had practiced her curtsies until her knees bled, studied the ancient Fae tongues until her eyes burned, all for the hope that Prince Kaelan Vance would look past her human lineage and see the woman who would move mountains for him. But his eyes had always been cold, distant, and focused on a crown that required a pure bloodline. Now, as the ritual daggers gleamed and the high priest stepped forward to bind her life to a darkness he couldn't imagine, the heavy oak doors of the sanctum burst open with a force that shattered the silence of the ages. Hello to every single one of you joining us today. It is truly wonderful to have you here in this space where stories come alive. I'd love to know where in the world you are watching from. Please drop your country or city in the comments below. How are you doing today? I hope your heart is as ready for this journey as mine is. If you haven't already, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support means everything and ensures we can keep bringing these emotional tales to life together. Elara didn't turn around. She couldn't. The ink of the soul-binding curse was already beginning to crawl up her neck like frozen ivy. A black, necrotic lace that signified her life now belonged to the Shadowkin, the very monster she had agreed to wed to save Kaelan's kingdom from total annihilation. She felt the sudden violent shift in the room's temperature. The air, once stagnant and oppressive, was suddenly charged with the scent of ozone and winter pines. Stop the ritual. The voice was a roar, a command that vibrated in Elara's very marrow. It was a voice she had heard in her dreams, the voice she had waited a lifetime to hear directed at her. Prince Kaelan stood at the end of the long stone aisle, his silver armor charred from battle, his chest heaving. He wasn't looking at the high priest. He wasn't looking at the horrified nobles. His gaze was locked on Elara's back, raw and desperate. For the first time in his immortal life, the Fae Prince wasn't poised or perfect. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and realized he'd left his heart inside it. Elara, he choked out, his voice cracking, a sound so human it made her knees buckle. I was wrong. The blood, the laws, they don't matter. It has always been you. I choose you. I claim you as my consort now and forever. A year ago, those words would have been her salvation. A month ago they would have been her greatest joy. But as the Shadowkin groom stepped out from the veil of darkness beside the altar, his clawed hand resting possessively on Elara's shoulder, she finally turned to look at the prince. The black veins of the curse reached her jawline, turning her skin a translucent, ghostly gray. She looked at Kaelan, the man who had finally found his courage, and felt nothing but a hollow, aching pity. The choice he had finally made was a bridge built over a dried-up river. Kaelan, she whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a grave. The sun has set on that dream. The high priest didn't stop. He lowered the blade. As the first drop of her blood hit the obsidian floor, a shockwave of dark energy threw Kaelan backward. He scrambled to his feet, reaching out a hand that was just inches too short to catch her. Was the love of a prince enough to break a contract signed in blood with the King of Shadows? Or had Kaelan Vance waited so long to speak his truth that he was now destined to be the spectator of his own heart's destruction? To understand the tragedy of that moment in the sanctum, one must understand the girl Elara Thorne was before the shadows took her. She was the daughter of a disgraced human diplomat, a guest of the Fae court who was treated as little more than part of the architecture. Her deepest desire wasn't power or jewels. It was simply to be seen. She lived in the drafty North Tower, where the stone walls felt like frozen skin, spending her nights poring over ancient maps and Fae history, hoping that knowledge would make her indispensable to the man who occupied every corner of her mind. Elara was a creature of quiet resilience. She had a habit of biting her lip when she was nervous, a trait that the elegant Fae ladies mocked, but it was the physical manifestation of her constant battle to keep her heart from spilling out. Her fear was never death, it was insignificance. She dreaded the thought of living a full human life and dying without Kaelan Vance ever knowing that it was her tactical advice, whispered through his advisors, that had saved his border settlements 3 winters ago. Kaelan, by contrast, was a man built of marble and duty. As the crown prince of the Ethelgard realm, his life was a series of calculations. He had been raised by his father, King Alaric Vance, a man whose heart had been replaced by the cold logic of survival, to believe that love was a luxury for those who didn't carry the weight of a dying son on their shoulders. Kaelin was stunningly beautiful, with eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea and hair like spun moonlight, but he moved through the court with a calculated frost. He saw Alara certainly. He noticed the way she smelled of wildflowers in a court of heavy perfumes. He noticed the sharp intelligence in her eyes. But he viewed her as a distraction, a mortal frailty he couldn't afford to indulge while the Shadowkin pressed against their borders. The bridge between these two worlds was Clara Ridley, Alara's only confidant. Clara was a minor Fae noble with a rebellious streak who had been sidelined for her tasteless empathy toward humans. "You're wasting your soul on a statue, Alara," Clara would often say, brushing Alara's chestnut hair as they watched the prince train in the courtyard below. "He's been taught that feeling is a flaw. You're all feeling. You're trying to warm a glacier with a candle." "I don't need him to be a fire," Alara would whisper, her eyes never leaving the rhythmic lethal grace of Kaelin's swordplay. "I just need him to know that if the glacier melts, I'll be the one to catch the water." The stakes of their unspoken connection were heightened by the presence of Julian Blackwood, the High Commander of the Fae Guard. Julian was Kaelin's closest friend and most trusted soldier, a man who saw the prince's inner struggle more clearly than Kaelin did himself. Julian carried a secret of his own, a deep, protective respect for Alara that bordered on love, though he stifled it out of loyalty to his prince. He was the one who saw Alara's silent sacrifices, the way she skipped meals to ensure the human servants were fed during the famine, and the way she stayed up until dawn translating war scrolls that Kaelin refused to acknowledge came from her hand. "He looks for you, you know," Julian told her once, catching her in the library. "When the room is crowded and the politics get loud, his eyes always drift toward the corner where you stand. He's just a coward, Alara. He's afraid that if he lets you in, he won't be able to let the crown stay on." But the secrets of the court ran deeper than unrequited love. Deep in the bowels of the palace, King Alaric was hiding the truth about the waning, the slow death of Fae magic. The realm wasn't just under attack by the Shadowkin. It was starving. The only way to replenish the magic was through a massive sacrifice or a union with the void itself. Alara felt the shift in the atmosphere weeks before the disaster. The flowers in the royal gardens began to weep black nectar, and the Fae guards grew restless, their silver armor tarnishing in a single night. She felt a pulling in her gut, an intuition that whispered of an approaching storm. She tried to reach Kaelin to warn him of the patterns she'd seen in the ancient texts regarding the waning, but she was barred from his chambers. "The prince is preparing for his betrothal negotiations," the guards told her. That was the day the light in Alara's world flickered. She realized that while she had been planning a life around him, he was planning a realm without her. She retreated to the archives, her heart a leaden weight, and that was where she found the Pact of the Eclipse, a forbidden ritual that could save the kingdom but required a human vessel to anchor the dark magic. She didn't know then that she would be the one to sign it. She only knew that the man she loved was about to marry a high Fae princess to save a crown that was already cracking, and the thought of him being bound to a lie was more than she could bear. Little did she know, Kaelin was sitting in his study at that very moment, staring at a small ribbon she had dropped months ago, his hand hovering over the order to have her sent away to the human territories for her own safety. He thought he was protecting her. He didn't realize he was abandoning the only anchor he had left. The emotional tether between them was a fraying rope, held together by silences and missed opportunities. As the Shadowkin's emissary arrived at the gates, not with a declaration of war, but with an offer of a marriage of shadows, the foundation of Alara's devotion began to crumble, replaced by a desperate, sacrificial resolve. If Kaelin wouldn't choose her for love, she would make him choose her for survival. The sky over Ethelgard didn't turn black. It turned the color of a bruised lung. The air grew heavy with the taste of copper and the sound of 1,000 whispering insects. It was the day of the great negotiation, the moment the realm expected Prince Kaelin to announce his union with a high Fae duchess to solidify the elemental borders. Instead, the gates of the capital groaned open not for a bride, but for the Malachor, the herald of the Shadowkin. The Malachor was a creature of smoke and jagged obsidian, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that made the Fae guards drop their spears in primal fear. He didn't come to conquer, he came to collect. He brought an ultimatum that shattered the last of the king's composure. The waning had progressed too far. The Fae sun was dying. Unless a living bridge was formed between the light and the void, Ethelgard would be consumed by eternal frost within 3 moons. The price is a soul, the Malachor hissed, his voice echoing through the throne room like glass grinding on stone. A human soul, pure of intent but forged in the fires of your court. She must wed the Shadow King and in doing so become the conduit that feeds your dying son. In the back of the hall, Elara felt the world tilt. She saw Kaelin rise from his seat, his hand flying to the hilt of his blade, his face a mask of fury. "We do not trade lives for light," Kaelin shouted, his voice ringing with a desperate nobility. "We will fight. We will bleed. But we will not succumb to such butchery." But King Alaric's face was ashen. He knew what Kaelin didn't, that the armies were already hollowed out by the waning, their magic flickering like dying candles. "The prince is young and idealistic," the king whispered, his voice trembling. "But the crown must be pragmatic. Who's this girl? Who fits the criteria?" The Malachor's gaze, a void of absolute darkness, swept over the room. It bypassed the shimmering Fae princesses and the stoic duchesses. It landed with the weight of a mountain directly on Elara Thorne. "There," the herald pointed. "The one who has loved the moon while living in the dirt. She is the only one with a heart strong enough to survive the Shadow King's touch." The room went deathly silent. Kaelin's head whipped around, his eyes wide with a shock that quickly morphed into a terrifying, protective rage. For a heartbeat the mask slipped. His lips parted as if to scream her name, to claim her, to forbid the very air from touching her. But the king's hand gripped Kaelin's arm like a vice. "No," Kaelin breathed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Not her. Anyone but her." Elara stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Kaelin, searching for the words she had waited a decade to hear. "Say it," she thought. "Tell them I belong to you. Tell them you love me and I will stay and fight by your side until we are both ash." But the prince's gaze faltered. He looked at his father, then at the dying light of the stained glass windows, then at the thousands of lives outside the palace walls. The silence stretched, a yawning chasm of hesitation. In that silence, Elara's hope didn't just die, it was executed. She realized that even now, at the end of the world, he was calculating the cost of her life against the stability of his throne. "I will do it," Elara said, her voice clear and terrifyingly calm. The shock in the room was palpable. Julian Blackwood made a move toward her, his face twisted in agony, but Elara held up a hand. She looked directly at Kaelin, watching the color drain from his face until he looked like a ghost. "On one condition," Elara continued, her eyes hard as diamonds. "The Shadowkin must withdraw from the southern villages immediately. My people must be protected, fed and given passage to the neutral lands. If I am to be the bridge, I will not have my sacrifice wasted on a king who cannot protect his own borders." "Elara, stop this!" Kaelin roared, finally breaking free of his father's grip. He lunged toward her, reaching for her hand, but the Malachor stepped between them, a wall of cold shadow erupting from the floor. "The contract is struck," the herald declared. "The girl has chosen. The prince has hesitated." In that moment, a dark, shimmering mark appeared on the back of Elara's right hand, the mark of the Shadow King's betrothal. It burned like ice, a searing cold that traveled up her arm and settled in her chest, freezing the warmth of her human blood. Kaelin stood paralyzed, his hands still outstretched, his fingers trembling. He looked at the mark on her skin and for the first time, the realization of what he was losing hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He hadn't just lost a servant or a mortal distraction. He had lost the only person who had ever truly loved the man beneath the crown. "I'm doing this for the realm, Kaelin," Elara whispered, her voice devoid of the warmth he had taken for granted. "Since you couldn't bring yourself to do anything at all." As the Malachor led her away toward the preparation chambers, the first major twist of the night occurred. A messenger burst into the hall, falling to his knees. "The southern gate. It's not the Shadowkin. The High Fae duchesses have staged a coup. They've opened the gates to the void themselves to force the prince's hand." The betrayal was internal. The sacrifice Elara had just made was based on a lie orchestrated by the very Fae nobility Kaelin had tried so hard to appease. She had sold her soul to save a kingdom that was being stabbed in the back by its own pure bloodlines. Kaelin watched her go, his heart fracturing. The girl he loved was now the property of a monster, and the people he served were the ones who had signed her death warrant. The inciting incident hadn't just launched a conflict, it had set a countdown. Elara had 3 days before the wedding of shadows would finalize the bond, making her a permanent fixture of the Dark Realm. 3 days for a prince who had spent a lifetime being late to finally find his way to the truth. The 3 days leading up to the wedding of shadows felt like a slow-motion descent into a frozen hell. Elara was confined to the Twilight Suite, a room where the walls were made of smoked glass that reflected only the darkest versions of one's own thoughts. She was no longer dressed in the modest cottons of a human servant. She was draped in void silk, a fabric that felt like cold water sliding over her skin and hummed with a low, predatory magic. As the hours ticked by, the romantic tension that had simmered for years between Elara and Kaelin didn't vanish. It intensified, fueled by the agonizing what-ifs of a doomed future. Kaelin, now a prince of a crumbling court and a broken heart, spent his nights pacing the hallway outside her door, barred from entry by the Shadowkin guards. On the second night, Julian Blackwood risked everything to smuggle Kaelin into the gardens beneath her balcony. When Elara stepped out into the biting air, she saw Kaelin standing among the dying lilies, his face haggard. "Elara, I have a plan," he whispered, his voice desperate. "Julian has secured a passage through the Iron Mountains. We can flee to the human territories. I'll renounce the throne. I'll be a nameless wanderer as long as I am with you." Elara looked down at him, her heart breaking all over again. A month ago she would have leapt from the balcony into his arms. But now she raised her right hand, where the shadow mark had begun to pulse with a sickly violet light. "And what of the waning, Kaelin?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears blurring her vision. "If I flee, the conduit breaks. The sun dies. Every child in Ethelgard freezes in their sleep. Can you live with that? Can you love me while the ghosts of your people scream in your ears?" The silence that followed was the most painful obstacle they had ever faced. Kaelin's growth was being forged in the hottest fire. He was finally learning that being a king meant more than following laws. It meant bearing the burden of choice. He reached up, his fingers grazing the cold stone of the balcony. "I spent my life trying to be the perfect heir for a father who didn't care about my heart," Kaelin choked out. "I thought by staying distant I was keeping you safe from the target on my back. I didn't realize I was the one hurting you most." As they spoke, the mystery of the coup deepened. Clara Ridley, using her Fae abilities to blend into the shadows, brought Elara a chilling discovery. The duchesses who had staged the coup weren't working alone. They were being manipulated by a red herring, a figure they believed to be a rebel leader, but who was actually an agent of the Shadow King himself. The Shadow King didn't just want a bridge. He wanted to provoke Kaelin into a war that would justify the total absorption of Ethelgard. "They are setting him up, Elara," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "If Kaelin attacks the Malachor to save you, it breaks the ancient peace treaty. The shadows won't just feed the sun, they will replace it." The tension escalated as Kaelin began to suspect the same. He found himself caught between his burning desire to storm the Twilight Suite and the cold realization that any move he made could be the trigger for his kingdom's demise. He was being tested, not just as a lover but as a strategist. Each interaction between Elara and Kaelin during these stolen moments was charged with a new raw intimacy. They spoke of the things they had never dared to mention. The way he had once secretly watched her dance alone in the library, the way she had embroidered his house crest into her inner bodice so it would always be close to her skin. These revelations, meant to bring them together, only served to highlight the tragedy of their timing. "Why now?" Elara cried out softly during their final meeting before the ceremony. "Why do you tell me these things when I am already a ghost?" "Because," Kaelin replied, his eyes burning with a fierce, newfound hope. "If I am to lose you, I want you to go into the dark knowing that you were the only light I ever truly followed. And because I am not finished fighting for you even if the enemy is fate itself." But as the morning of the third day dawned, a new obstacle appeared. The Shadow King himself arrived at the gates, not as a monster, but in the form of a man with eyes like shattered mirrors. He didn't come for a bride, he came for a sacrifice. He revealed a secret that Elara had hidden even from herself. The ritual wouldn't just bind her to him, It would slowly erase her memories of her life in Ethelgard. By the time the sun set, she wouldn't even remember Kaelin's name. The pressure was now a physical weight. Kaelin had hours to uncover the true mastermind behind the coup and find a loophole in the Pact of the Eclipse, or he would be forced to watch the woman he loved forget him while she saved his life. Every word they exchanged felt like the last, every glance a frantic attempt to memorize the curve of a lip or the depth of an eye. The fuse was lit and the explosion was only moments away. The air in the great hall of Ethelgard didn't just feel cold. It felt brittle, as if the very atoms of reality were cracking under the strain of the impending union. Elara sat on a dais of obsidian, her vision swimming with the violet haze of the mark on her skin. She felt her memories of the palace gardens, the smell of rain on stone, the sound of Kaelin's laughter from years ago, beginning to fray at the edges, dissolving into a gray mist. Kaelin stood at the base of the dais, his knuckles white as he gripped the hilt of his father's ancestral sword. The Shadow King, now appearing in a human form that was hauntingly beautiful yet terrifyingly empty, stood beside Elara, his hand hovering inches from her throat. "The time has come, Prince," the Shadow King said, his voice a melodic chime that set Alara's teeth on edge. "Claim your son and let me claim my bridge." But as the High Priest raised the chalice to finalize the binding, Kaelin didn't step back in defeat. He stepped forward, and for the first time he wasn't looking at the Shadow King. He was looking at his father, King Alaric. "The waning isn't a natural cycle, is it, father?" Kaelin's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. The room went deathly still. The high Fae duchesses who had been whispering in the shadows froze. "Kaelin, stand down," the king commanded, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp fear. "I spent the last 12 hours in the sealed vaults," Kaelin continued, his gaze never wavering. "The records don't match. The magic isn't dying. It's being siphoned." He turned to the room, his eyes blazing with a revelation that shattered the very foundation of their reality. "There is no Pact of the Eclipse to save the realm. There is only a debt. My father made a deal 30 years ago to extend his own immortality, and the price he promised was the soul of the first human woman who would truly love the heir of Ethelgard. He didn't just let Elara sacrifice herself. He cultivated her for it. He kept her in this palace, allowed her to pine for me, and ensured I remained distant so that her longing would grow strong enough to power the siphon." A collective gasp ripped through the hall. Elara felt the revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her entire life, her love, her pain, her silent devotion, hadn't been a tragic accident of fate. It had been a harvest. She wasn't a hero saving her people. She was a battery being plugged into a machine of her king's making. "Is it true?" Elara whispered, her voice cracking the silence. King Alaric didn't look at her. He couldn't. His silence was the loudest confession of all. The Shadow King laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "He speaks the truth. Your king is a far greater monster than I could ever hope to be. I only came to collect what was legally promised. But the prince, he found the fine print." Kaelin moved then, not toward the king but toward Elara. He bypassed the Shadow King's guards, his presence so commanding that even the shadows recoiled. He reached out and took Alara's marked hand, pulling her toward him. For the first time he didn't care about the laws, the court, or the consequences. "The contract is void," Kaelin roared, his voice echoing to the rafters. "Because the heart that was promised was never his to give. And it was never mine to take. It belongs to Elara, and she has revoked her consent to this lie." In that moment of shared vulnerability, Kaelin pulled Elara into his arms. The cold of the shadow mark met the heat of his Fae blood, and for a second, a blinding white light erupted between them. It wasn't the light of the sun. It was the light of a truth finally spoken. "I love you," Kaelin whispered into her hair, his tears hot against her skin. "I've loved you since the day you brought me that bruised apple in the orchards when we were children. I was just too much of a coward to deserve you." But the revelation had raised the stakes to their absolute peak. By exposing the king's lie, Kaelin hadn't just saved Elara. He had declared war on both his own father and the Shadow King. The waning accelerated instantly as the siphon was disrupted. The floor beneath them began to groan as the very castle started to crumble into the void. The Shadow King's face twisted into something monstrous. "If I cannot have the bridge," he hissed, "then no one shall have the shore." With a flick of his wrist, the Shadow King tore the air open. A vortex of absolute nothingness began to swallow the great hall. In the chaos, King Alaric was the first to be pulled in, his crown clattering across the stone as he disappeared into the dark he had tried so hard to outrun. Kaelin held onto Alara with a strength that transcended the physical, but the force of the void was insurmountable. As the shadows lunged for them, the betrayal of the duchesses was fully realized. They hadn't just wanted power. They had been promised safety in the Shadow Realm, and now they were closing the exits. Kaelin! Alara screamed as a lash of shadow wrapped around her waist, dragging her toward the rift. The midpoint revelation had changed everything. It wasn't about a marriage anymore. It was about a survival that seemed impossible. They were standing on the edge of the end, and the only thing they had left was a love that had been realized too late to be easy, but perhaps just in time to be their only weapon. The scream that tore from Kaelin's throat was not that of a prince, but of a man watching his universe collapse into a single point of nothingness. As the rift widened, the gravity of the void began to liquefy the very stone beneath their feet. The void silk gown Alara wore suddenly betrayed her, the fabric coming alive and wrapping around her limbs like cold, constricting serpents, dragging her toward the obsidian mouth of the Shadow King's realm. "Hold on to me!" Kaelin roared, his fingers digging into Alara's wrist with a strength that threatened to bruise. His boots skidded toward the edge of the abyss, the sparks from his heels the only light left in the suffocating gloom. But the Shadow King was done with games. He stepped into the center of the vortex, his form expanding until he was a towering pillar of frozen smoke. With a casual flick of his hand, a wave of necrotic energy slammed into Kaelin's chest. The prince was thrown backward, his grip on Alara's hand slipping, inch by agonizing inch, until their fingertips were the only thing connecting them to a shared reality. Kaelin let go. Alara sobbed, the black lace of the curse now stinging her eyes, blurring her vision into a kaleidoscope of gray and purple. "If you don't, it will take you too. The realm needs a king. The realm can burn." Kaelin screamed back, his voice raw and bloodied. "I am not losing you again. Not to my father's lies and not to this." But the separation was inevitable. A jagged shard of the falling ceiling struck the floor between them, a literal wedge of fate. The impact severed their contact. Alara felt the sickening sensation of weightlessness as she was sucked into the rift. For a heartbeat she saw Kaelin's face, distorted by a despair so profound it looked like a death mask, before the darkness swallowed her whole. Silence followed. Not a peaceful silence but the ringing, hollow silence of a vacuum. Kaelin lay on the cracked floor of the great hall, his hands clawing at the empty air where she had been. The Shadow King was gone. The rift had sealed, leaving behind only a faint, shimmering scar in the air that smelled of ozone and lost dreams. The duchesses had fled into the night, and the king was a memory consumed by the dark. Julian Blackwood staggered toward the prince, his own armor shattered, his face streaked with soot. He reached down to pull Kaelin up, but the prince remained limp, a hollow shell of the man who had stood so defiantly only minutes before. "She's gone, Julian," Kaelin whispered, his voice a ghost of itself. "I finally told her, and she's gone." "We can find a way," Julian urged, though his voice lacked conviction. "How?" Kaelin turned his storm-colored eyes toward his friend, and Julian flinched at the sheer vacuum of hope within them. The pact was tied to her heart. The Shadow King has the heart and the waning is complete. "Look." Julian looked toward the great windows. Outside, the Fae sun, the eternal source of their life and magic, had finally flickered out. Ethelgard was plunged into a supernatural winter. The trees in the gardens began to shatter like glass in the sudden absolute cold. The people in the streets below were screaming, their hearths turning to ice in seconds. In the Shadow Realm, Alara was experiencing a different kind of horror. She wasn't dead, but she was being unmade. She stood in a forest of white leafless trees where the ground was made of ash. The Shadow King stood before her, no longer a monster but a cold, indifferent force. "You are the bridge now, Alara Thorn," he said. "Every memory of the warmth of the sun, every memory of the prince's touch, is being drained from you to fuel the darkness. You will remain here for eternity, a battery of pure human emotion, until there is nothing left of the girl who loved a statue." Alara tried to scream Kaelin's name, but the name felt slippery, like water through her fingers. "K. The image of his blue-gray eyes began to fade into the gray of the ash. She felt the warmth of her own blood cooling, her heartbeat slowing to the rhythmic thud of a funeral drum. She was alone in the ultimate darkest hour, separated from her love, stripped of her identity, and serving as the unwitting power source for the destruction of everyone she had ever known. The situation was beyond hopeless. The king was dead, the prince was broken, the sun was gone, and the heroine was a prisoner of her own disappearing mind. The Shadow King had won not through strength, but through the patient cruelty of waiting for a prince to be too late. The silence in the ruined Great Hall was broken not by a trumpet, but by the sound of Kaelin's own blood dripping onto the obsidian floor. He stared at the spot where Alara had vanished, his vision blurring. Despair is a heavy cloak, but as the supernatural frost began to crystallize on his silver pauldrons, a different heat began to stir in his chest, a localized, searing burn that centered right over his heart. He reached inside his tunic and pulled out a small, crumpled object. It was the ribbon Alara had dropped months ago, a simple scrap of blue silk that smelled faintly of the lavender she used to ward off the North Tower's dampness. As the temperature of the room plummeted toward absolute zero, the ribbon began to glow with a soft, pulsing golden light. "Julian," Kaelin whispered, his voice gaining a sudden, terrifying clarity. "Look." Julian Blackwood knelt beside him, his breath coming in ragged plumes of mist. "The ribbon. It shouldn't be doing that. There's no magic left in Ethelgard to fuel it." "It's not Fae magic," Kaelin said, standing up with a grace that sent shards of ice flying from his armor. "It's hers. My father siphoned her love for years, but he was a fool. You can't siphon a well that replenishes itself. He thought her love was a finite resource, a battery to be drained. But love like hers, it's a forge." Kaelin realized the truth that had been hidden in the Pact of the Eclipse all along, the loophole his father had missed in his arrogance. The contract required a soul pure of intent. But by choosing Kaelin after he had failed her, by choosing to save the realm despite his hesitation, Alara hadn't just fulfilled the contract, she had transcended it. She wasn't just a bridge, she was the architect. She's not just a prisoner in the Shadow Realm, Kaelin realized, his eyes igniting with a storm-blue fire. She is the only thing keeping that realm from collapsing into ours. She is the anchor. And if I can reach the anchor, I can pull the whole world back through. In the Shadow Realm, Alara was sinking into the ash, her eyes turning a milky, translucent gray. The Shadow King stood over her, his hand raised to deliver the final stroke of erasure. Kaelin, she thought, but the name was now just a collection of sounds. K. Suddenly, a vibration shook the ashen ground. It wasn't a physical tremor, it was the sound of a heartbeat. Thump thump. Thump thump. A tear, warm and impossibly bright, rolled down Alara's cheek. Where it hit the ash, a single vibrant green sprout erupted from the dead earth. The Shadow King recoiled, his features twisting in genuine shock. "Impossible," he hissed. "There is no life here. There is only the end." Back in Ethelgard, Kaelin didn't look for a portal or a spell. He looked for Julian. "I need you to lead the survivors to the Sunforge in the basement. If I'm going to do this, I need a catalyst. I need every person who ever received a kindness from Alara to hold her name in their minds. We aren't fighting with steel anymore, Julian. We're fighting with the only thing the shadows can't imitate, a memory that refuses to die." Kaelin walked to the center of the scar in the air. He didn't use a sword, he used the ribbon. He wrapped the blue silk around his hand, the golden glow intensifying until it was blinding. He realized that to save her he had to stop being a prince who followed rules and start being the man who would break the universe to reach her. "Alara," he roared, his voice piercing the veil between worlds. "I am coming for you. Don't you dare forget me." At the sound of his voice, the gray mist in Alara's mind shattered. The K became a face. They became a touch. The E became the memory of a bruised apple in an orchard 30 years ago. Her eyes snapped back to their deep human brown. She reached out her hand, not in surrender but in a command. The turning point was reached. The bridge didn't just hold, it began to pull back. The prince had found his strength and the girl had found her voice. Together they had turned a sacrifice into a rebellion. The fabric of reality didn't just tear, it shrieked. As Kaelin Vance stepped into the shimmering scar left by the void, He wasn't just a man entering a portal. He was a living solar flare entering a world of absolute zero. The blue ribbon wrapped around his fist pulsed with a rhythmic golden heat, the physical heartbeat of Alara's devotion, acting as a compass through the screaming winds of the Shadow Realm. "You dare." The Shadow King's voice boomed, no longer melodic but a tectonic grinding of plates. "A Fae Prince, stripped of his son, thinks he can challenge the King of Entropy in his own house?" Kalen didn't answer with words. He answered with the raw, unadulterated power of a man who had finally stopped calculating. As he landed on the ashen plains, he saw her. Alara was suspended in a cage of jagged obsidian ribs, her skin almost translucent, the black veins of the curse pulsing like a dying star. The Shadow King loomed over her, a gargantuan shadow that blotted out the starless sky. "Alara." Kalen's voice cut through the howling dark. She looked up, her eyes flickering between the gray of the void and the warmth of his memory. "Kalen, go back. You're burning away." He was right. The Shadow Realm was eating him. Every step Kalen took toward her cost him a piece of his immortality. His silver armor began to flake into black dust, his skin cracked with the cold. But he didn't stop. He channeled every ounce of the love he had suppressed for a decade into the ribbon. The Shadow King lunged, a wave of liquid darkness crashing toward Kalen. "She belongs to the silence now." But then the most satisfying twist of all occurred. Throughout Ethelgard, Julian Blackwood had gathered the servants, the soldiers and the common folk Alara had protected. They didn't offer magic, they offered recognition. As thousands of voices whispered her name in the physical world, the anchor in Alara's chest didn't just hold, it exploded. "I do not belong to the silence." Alara screamed, her voice regaining its human fire. The obsidian cage shattered. The void silk gown she wore, designed to drain her, suddenly reversed its flow. Because Kalen was touching the ribbon, the physical link to her soul, he became the conduit she needed. The love he had finally admitted acted as a lightning rod. The siphoned magic that King Alaric had stolen for 30 years, stored within the foundations of the Shadow Realm, found a new path. It didn't go to the king. It flowed through Alara into Kalen and back out into the universe. Kalen reached her just as the Shadow King struck with a blade of pure nothingness. Kalen didn't parry, he caught the blade with his bare ribbon-wrapped hand. The golden light met the black steel, and the resulting shockwave sent a ripple of color through the gray forest. "You forgot one thing," Kalen hissed, his eyes glowing with a blinding celestial white. "A bridge works both ways." With a roar of triumph, Kalen pulled Alara toward him. In that moment of absolute authentic connection, they weren't a prince and a servant. They were the twin sons of a new era. The light didn't just push the Shadow King back, it began to dissolve him. The King of Shadows was a creature of absence, and in the presence of a love that had survived betrayal, neglect and death itself, there was no room for him to exist. "Now!" Alara cried, grabbing Kalen's hand. Together they didn't flee the Shadow Realm, they reclaimed it. The green sprout she had created earlier accelerated, turning into a massive glowing oak tree that tore through the ashen ground. The gray sky cracked, revealing a sky of brilliant, violet dawn. The Shadow King dissipated into mist, a defeated whisper lost in the wind of their combined wills. The climax reached its peak as the rift in Ethelgard began to pull them home. Kalen held Alara against his chest, his heart beating against hers in a perfect, synchronized rhythm. Justice wasn't just served to the Shadow King. It was served to the memory of the cold, calculating Prince Kalen used to be. He had finally made his choice and he had made it with every fiber of his being. As they tumbled back through the portal and hit the floor of the Great Hall, a massive pulse of golden energy rippled out from the palace. It hit the frozen gardens, the icy streets and the dying sun. The waning didn't just stop, it reversed. The Fae sun ignited with a warmth it hadn't known in centuries, fueled no longer by stolen life, but by the renewable forge of two souls who had chosen each other against all odds. The golden light that had erupted from the palace didn't just fade. It settled into the very stones of Ethelgard like a warm, living pulse. As the dust of the collapsed rift cleared, the great hall was no longer a tomb of shadows. Sunlight, pure and unapologetic, streamed through the high windows, illuminating the two figures huddled together on the obsidian floor. Kalen didn't move for a long time. He held Alara as if the air itself might try to steal her again. His silver armor was gone, replaced by a simple, scorched tunic, and the cold frost of his Fae lineage had been replaced by a grounded human warmth. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, those deep brown eyes that were no longer milky or gray, but bright with the recognition of a life regained. "You're here," he whispered, his voice thick with a relief that sounded like a prayer. "I didn't lose you." Alara reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. The black mark on her hand had faded into a thin, silvery scar, a permanent reminder of the bridge she had built, but one that no longer carried the sting of a curse. "You came for me, Kaelin. You chose me when the whole world told you not to. I'll choose you every morning for the rest of my life," he promised, leaning his forehead against hers. "The throne, the laws, the bloodlines, they were just walls I built to hide from how much I needed you. I'm done hiding." The growth in both of them was visible to the silent crowd of survivors who began to emerge from the corners of the hall. Julian Blackwood stepped forward, his eyes shimmering with uncharacteristic moisture. He didn't bow to a prince. He walked to a friend and offered a hand to pull them both up. The hierarchy that had nearly destroyed them had been dismantled by the very sacrifice intended to preserve it. In the weeks that followed, Ethelgard underwent a transformation that no map could capture. With King Alaric gone and the pure duchesses in exile, Kaelin refused the title of High King in the old sense. Instead, he and Alara established the Accord of the Sun Forge. The division between Fae and human was officially dissolved, and the magic of the realm, now fueled by the authentic emotional resonance of its people rather than siphoned life, became accessible to all who lived with intent. Clara Ridley was appointed as the High Archivist, ensuring that the history of Alara's sacrifice and the king's betrayal was never forgotten, serving as a warning to future generations that duty without love is just a slow-acting poison. The romantic subplot reached its fulfilling peak on a quiet evening in the royal orchards, the very place where Alara had once given a young prince a bruised apple. The trees were heavy with fruit, their leaves shimmering with a healthy emerald glow. There was no grand ceremony, no cold political negotiations. Under the light of a sun that would never again wane, Kaelin slipped a ring onto Alara's finger. It wasn't made of gold or diamonds, but of a strange, iridescent metal forged from the remains of the Shadow Rift and the blue ribbon he had carried through the dark. "It's not a crown," Kaelin said softly, his eyes reflecting the violet twilight. "It's a promise that I will never be late again." Alara laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened joy that echoed through the trees. "You were just on time, Kaelin Vance. Exactly when I needed you to be." As they stood together, looking out over a kingdom that was finally breathing, the loose ends of the mystery were tied. The Shadowkin hadn't been destroyed, but they had retreated to the deep places, bound by a new treaty that respected the boundaries of the light. The people of the southern villages were thriving, led by humans who now sat on the High Council alongside Fae lords. The story that began with a girl loving from afar and a prince trapped by his own crown ended with two souls who had rewritten their fate. They had proven that while love delayed is a tragedy, love fought for is a triumph that can relight the sun. Thank you so much for staying with us through this epic journey of heart and shadow. It has been an absolute honor to share Alara and Kaelin's story with you. If this tale moved you, please let us know in the comments. What was your favorite twist? And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next emotional adventure. Until next time, keep your light burning bright.